Hello, I'm Ciarán Lynch and welcome to OviCast, the Teagasc Sheep podcast. Each episode will bring latest insights, advice and technical updates for the sheep industry. In this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Philip Creighton and Frank Campion to discuss some key aspects of forage crop management. As good utilisation is vital to any of these crops, Philip outlines how to approach setting up grazing divisions and how to manage these crops in difficult conditions. On the subject of divisions, Frank highlights the importance of fencer setup and takes us through how to transition lambs onto the various crops in Athenry. He also highlights the importance of shearing lambs prior to grazing these forage crops. We finish up with Frank outlining the ongoing trial, assessing the performance of hill-bred store lambs when grazed on forage crops that's currently underway in Athenry. We start off, however, with Philip discussing the importance of assessing yield of the crop and outlining how to work out the carrying capacity.
It's vitally important that you know exactly what you're dealing with on your own farm. I suppose the common range of forages that are there, kind of yield-wise, you can range from your forage rape, where you might expect a yield of 4 to 6 tonne per hectare of dry matter. Then maybe moving into your hybrid brassicas, where you might be going from 6 to 8 tonne expected, and then up to maybe the likes of your kale, where you could be up on 8 to 10 tonne of dry matter per hectare. But obviously, as you say then, that's the theoretical expected yield. There's a lot of things that can influence that. So when they were sown, where they were sown, background fertility, that sort of thing. So the important thing would be to make an assessment then of what your actual crop is yielding.
It's not actually a difficult process to go about measuring it, Philip. It's probably one that's not done often enough for crops. Maybe you just take us through the basics of like how would you go about estimating yield of one of them forages?
Yeah, so the simplest way really is that if you were to make up some sort of a quadrat, so ideally a 1 metre by 1 metre quadrat, you could make that up with steel or even timber. And if you were to bring that out into the crop, place it down in a representative area of the crop that you're working with, cut all the material within that 1 metre by 1 metre square then. So the likes of a clippers, a garden clippers, or maybe some sort of a slash to cut the crop depending on how strong it is. Gather all of that up, put it into a plastic bag, and get the fresh weight of the material that was within that quadrat. And then once we have that done, we can I suppose plug that fresh weight figure into a formula where if you have the fresh weight of the forage that you've weighed, you then estimate the dry matter. For most of these crops, unless it's exceptionally wet conditions, a safe enough dry matter to use would be somewhere around 12 to 13%. So what it would be your fresh weight. So for example, if you had 3.5 kilos of the forage in your bag, multiply that by 0.13 if you're saying it's 13% dry matter, and then multiply that by 10,000 because there would be 10,000 of those 1 metre by 1 metre quadrats in a hectare. And if we had that example and we worked it out, you would end up with a yield of approximately 4.5 tonnes of dry matter per hectare.
And again, like if there was ability in that crop, you might want to do more than one cut. A couple of cuts would give you a better representative sample of what's in the field.
Exactly. So I suppose if you're working with a large area and there is a lot of variation, 2 or 3 yield estimates like that and take the average of the 3 will give you the greatest indication of the potential total crop that you have, and you can use that then to try and plan out, you know, what you're going to have available and what your carrying capacity will be.
And really that is the important thing, because look, essentially with these crops, you want to be able to finish as many of them as you can and to make most use of them. So overstocking them, we're going to run out of it too quickly, and we might have a backup plan for that on a farm. And again, opposite, if we didn't have enough animals going on to it, we're not really making use of that crop at expenditure. So I suppose to an extent, Philip, the carrying capacity, it depends on what type of animal we're putting on it, and indeed possibly on the ground conditions as well at the time, or prevailing conditions for the winter. Just to give us a bit of a ballpark, like if we're talking about lambs on it first maybe, and maybe then ewes, what kind of intakes are we expecting?
Yeah, so your typical lowland type of a lamb, we say 35 to 45 kilos, will have an intake requirement of about 1.25 kilos, 1.25 kilos of dry matter per day. If you're dealing with lighter lambs, or maybe hill lambs where they're a lower live weight, you could probably bring that intake down to about 1 kilo. And then if you're moving into ewes, where you might be trying to maintain them over the winter, mid-pregnancy or whatever, you're probably talking an intake requirement of about 1.5 kilos of dry matter per day.
Like on that rate of going, your expected utilisation at that, because it's not going to be 100% utilised, and we know it can vary, but you're pitching that roughly at about what, 70%?
Yeah, so we'd be in your typical conditions, we'd be targeting about 70% utilisation. If conditions are better, obviously you'll do a bit better, but if things are very wet and you're having to move the animals on more frequently, wherever your utilisation will drop as well, and that needs to be taken into account.
So you need to give yourself a wee bit of scope, I suppose, depending on the time of year you're going in grazing it too.
Yeah, so I suppose if we were to look at an example of that, if we were to say our crop there that yielded 4.5 tonne of dry matter per hectare, and we're saying that possibly we're going to get 70% utilisation of that, you're talking maybe 3.2 tonnes utilisable per hectare. And then it's a question of looking at, what animals are you going to be grazing it with. So you would divide your 3.2 tonnes by the number of animals that you have, and divide that then by the intake that they're going to require every day. The thing to remember about the intake as well is that 25 to 30% of the diet should be made up of some other forage, form of forage or roughage, so maybe silage or hay or straw or something, to try and maintain room and function, and reduce any upsets. So you would factor some of that in terms of the daily requirement as well. But if we were taking an example of, say, if you had 100 ewes there, and we said they require maybe 1.5 kilos for the day, we allow that they're going to be eating a certain amount of roughage. So we're saying they're maybe going to be eating maybe 1.2 kilos of the crop. You would divide your 3.2 tonnes by 100 ewes, we'll say, divide that by your 1.2, and you come out with about 28 days of forage available per hectare. And you can adjust that then, depending on the number of sheep that you need to feed and the number of hectares you have to feed to them.
At least then you have a plan in place how long you're going to last on the crop. It gives you a bit of indication when you need to go into it as well, and when you can expect to come out of it. And again, I suppose, Phil, if the weather did turn more inclement, that buffer of the forage you're going to rely on it a little bit heavier. So it's not a case that you can't have a backup to it either. And possibly in lambs too, if you're to start supplementing if you're going to run short.
Exactly.
Just so if we have the crop sown, we have the yield of it now, we've worked out our carrying capacity. In terms of getting most out of the crop, there is a bit of management with these crops to get maximum benefit from them. Just in terms of setting up how you go out grazing the field, because it is quite a high yielding crop. It's important we get as much as we can out of it. Is there any tips you could offer on that?
The best way, I suppose, is to try and ration out the forage offer small amounts at a time. Using temporary fencing. In terms of maximising utilisation, the best way about going down that is to give long, narrow strips at a time rather than short and wide. So what I mean by that is you take the longer side of the field that they're in, and you put the fence up the long side of it, and give them a narrow strip every day or every 2 or 3 days, and let them graze that, and then move on again. If conditions are good, you can probably do that every 2 or 3 days. If conditions are bad, it could be a daily move, depending on what you're working with. The reason for that is that if we let them into a big area, or short and wide, as I said, and you get bad conditions, bad weather or poor underground conditions, you can dramatically reduce the utilisation percentage, because they're going to be walking a lot of the crop into the ground or dirtying the crop, and then it won't be eaten. So that would be the number one way of trying to maximize the utilization. If you're dealing with a sloping field, you should graze from the top down. Again, for the reason for that being that if you start at the bottom and conditions are poor, you can get runoff. So if you start at the top and there is some runoff, it doesn't run off. It's stopped by the crop below it.
Just in terms of time of day of allocation, I know there's certain issues around frozen crops, particularly if we head into the winter period and frosty mornings. The advice there to maybe allocate later in the day?
Yeah, so I suppose, again, deal with the conditions that you have. If it's very frosty in the morning, what should happen is wait for the frost to thaw, and then allocate. If it's a case that it's frozen for a prolonged period, maybe up the supplementation of the companion forage or whatever, so your silage or your hay or your straw, whatever, and wait until the actual crop thaws out before allocating.
Frank, I might just bring you in here for a moment. Like, you've grazed store lambs on these crops last year, not right. I know you have a trial ready to get underway again this year. We'll talk about in a moment. But in terms of divisions, certainly with the ewes, it might seem easier. They're more used to temporary fencing. How did you go about dividing your crops up last year for the hill store lambs?
Yeah, so last year for the hill store lambs, we just used electric fencer. So what we had was 4 lines of polywire across the crops. But what we were doing was we were cutting a break where the fencer was going across so that it wasn't earthing off the crop. And we found it very effective. Once there was sufficient power in the fence, the lambs did learn to obey it very quickly. But what we did notice quickly was, I suppose, the first time we put up the fence, we ran it through the crop and very quickly got drained off it. So it is important to put that break underneath the wire just to keep the power in it.
And checking you have good power in it to begin with, maybe even having training beforehand. But
yeah, it's nearly one thing you want to be doing every day, Ciarán, is checking the fence. I know the sheep will tell you quickly enough, but when you do go out in the morning to give them a new strip, check the power and just make sure it's staying in it, because very quickly you'll find them breaking ahead, and that's going to lead to all sorts of problems for you as you try and manage the crop and manage the stock on it.
And it won't be long changing that utilisation figure. It'll certainly go south of 70%. But it does lead us into another thing, Frank. Transitioning on to these crops, like it's a novel diet for a lot of them. You know, we have to avoid digestive upsets, and we want to get them trained in as quickly as possible. But at the same time, we have to be very conscious of that. How are you going to go about training in these lambs onto, or how did you do it last year?
Yeah, so look, it's a big change then, because you're putting them onto what is a low fibre source diet. You know, that's one of the reasons why we supplement when we have the lambs on the crops or ewes on the crops. So in our case, we'll be supplementing with straw once they're on the crop. But equally, because it's such a change in, I suppose, dietary type, they need to be adapted onto it over time. So for what we'll be doing is we'll be giving them a run back to grass. So basically, they'll be getting a couple of hours every day on the crop and run back to grass, and we'll build that up over kind of 7 to 10 days until they're full time on the crop. And that just allows their digestive system to adapt to it. No more than if you're adapting them on, I suppose, to an all concentrate diet, you build them up over time. We'll build them up to the crops over 7 to 10 days.
And that's the run back is kind of giving them the access to it.
The run back gives them a run back to grass. Like I said, they'll get a couple of hours in the crop, and then we'll lock them back out of the crop again. And every day we'll build that up until they're full time on the crops.
Frank, one of the challenges often experienced in these crops, particularly when conditions get poor, is getting the lambs off in a clean state to go to the factory. And look, often we'll hear about belly clipping and that on them as a way to alleviate some of that issues. How have you managed with the lambs at Athenry last year and this year?
Yeah, so look, that can be a challenge with them. So I suppose last year we crutched them and we belly shored them, and to be honest, we had no issues. But it is important when you're pulling off the lambs that you are checking them, and if you do have any dirty lambs, you might need to clip them again just to make sure that they're up to standard. This year we've fully shorn the lambs, and that's for other reasons, for experimental reasons as much as anything. But there does need to be some degree of shearing on them, be that a crutch or a belly shear or a complete shear.
And again, that's a couple of weeks before they're going to be drafted off it anyway. So I'm sure there's a bit of wool regrowth if you need remedial action again.
Exactly, Ciarán. That's why I say, like, it is important that you check them again when you pull them off. It is going to take a couple of weeks after they go on the crops for them to come fit again for the factory. So you will be able to take remedial action again. They'll have some wool regrowth. So I suppose it's important to have it done in time that you are allowing for some wool to grow back on them before you start drafting for the factory.
Okay. And just like for the coming year, what crops have you sown, and maybe just give us a quick indication of what you plan to do with them?
Yeah, so look, we went with the same crops last year: kale, forage rape, and hybrid brassica. The kale was sown in May, and Forage, rape and the red start were sown in June, and basically we're hoping to get lambs onto those crops in the kind of next 3 to 4 weeks. So we purchased all the lambs. They come in and they've done their quarantine. So we've bought in purebred hill lambs again, so Scottish blackface lambs. And we also brought in Texel Cross Scottish blackface lambs as well. So it'll be about half and half on each of the crop treatments.
Okay. What kind of yield have you got this year? Has it been a good year for growing on it?
It seems to be going okay at the minute, so we'd be estimating we're somewhere in the region of 5 to 6 ton on the crops. You know, and we still have another couple of weeks to go before we'd be grazing them. So we're happy enough with how they're going. Yields look okay.
Okay, certainly should be.
But I suppose it comes back to Phil's point earlier. We have 4 different replicas of each of the crops, and certainly there'll be a difference probably between those replicas. So it is important to go out and measure them and see what's actually in it. And we'll be measuring regularly as we go through it, just to make sure that we're allocating enough to the lambs on a daily basis.
Each will certainly be slightly different. It'll be an interesting trial to keep an eye on, Frank. I'm sure we'll get an update from you later on in the year.
Yep, definitely.
Phil, Frank, thanks very much for your time. Glad to have you on.
Thanks, Ciarán.
Thanks, Ciarán.
Okay, we'll wrap things up at this point. Again, a lot of good factors to consider when we're talking about forage crops, whether it's the first time growing them or you're looking to make more use out of them. I think there's some good tips in it. Again, we'll keep regular updates with the ongoing work in Athenry and the various forage crops. It'll be available in Sheep newsletter. We'll also have short clips on our YouTube channels, and we'll try and get a podcast with Frank later on in the year to see how the lambs are progressing on that trial. That's it for me. Again, for any updates on the programme, keep an eye on our Twitter page at Teagasc Sheep. I'm Ciarán Lynch. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe and tune in to future episodes.